You know what's crazy? The moment Caitlin Clark walked into that NBA broadcast world, it wasn't just a guest appearance. It felt like somebody quietly slid a match across a table full of gasoline and then acted surprised when people started panicking. Because here's the thing nobody says out loud. The NBA doesn't just protect players and highlights, it protects status. It protects who gets to sound smart about the game. It protects who's allowed to be treated like an authority. So when a 23-year-old WNBA superstar shows up on a primetime NBA desk, on a night with major eyes watching, this isn't just basketball anymore. This becomes a test. Not of her. A test of the entire system. A test of the old voices. A test of what fans will accept. And a test of whether the people who've been gatekeeping basketball commentary for decades can handle someone who doesn't fit the usual mold, walking in like she's always belonged there. Because the internet didn't react like it was a normal sports segment. It reacted like a nerve got hit. Some people acted like the league had just been exposed. Others acted like NBC had committed a crime. And the loudest critics didn't even wait to hear what she'd say. They were already angry at the idea of her being there. And that's where the real story starts, before she even speaks. See, every time a new face breaks into an old club, the first thing the club does is pretend it's not a club. They start throwing around words like experience and credentials and paid your dues. They make it sound polite, professional, like it's about quality control. But what they're really defending is the latter. The order. The unspoken rule that you're only allowed to have a seat at the table if the table says so. And Caitlin Clark showing up to talk NBA hoops on a major broadcast is basically someone walking into the VIP section without asking permission. That's why the reaction got so loud so fast. Because you could feel the fear underneath the opinions. Not fear like somebody's in danger. Fear like someone's role is at risk. Fear that the audience might actually like a different kind of voice. Fear that viewers might prefer someone who speaks with clarity over someone who speaks with clout. Fear that the next generation is going to look at the old format and go, wait, why was this the only option? And the funniest part is, the same people who swear they love competition suddenly hate it when the competition isn't coming from the usual places. So the moment gets framed as this massive gamble. A stunt. A marketing play. People start saying things like, they're just using her name. Or, this is for clicks. Or, this is what happens when networks don't respect the game. But watch how that logic works. When a former NBA player gets a seat, nobody screams stunt. Even if they can't explain a single adjustment without turning it into a motivational quote. Even if their analysis is basically, he wanted it more. Even if they repeat the same 3 lines every night with different player names. It's still earned. But when Caitlin Clark is the one on the desk, now we're suddenly strict about standards. And if you're paying attention, that tells you everything. Because this isn't really about her resume. It's about the fact that she represents something that makes the old guard uncomfortable. A new kind of basketball intelligence being taken seriously by a mainstream audience. Not whispered about. Not treated like a cute storyline. Taken seriously. And once that door cracks open, it doesn't close again. Now, here's the part that makes this whole situation feel even more intense. It wasn't some random Tuesday night game. This was one of those nights where the industry is watching the industry. Where executives aren't just watching the scoreboard, they're watching social media. They're watching the vibe. They're watching whether the broadcast feels like a moment or feels like background noise. Because sports TV isn't just competing with other sports TV anymore. It's competing with everything. Clips, podcasts, YouTubers, streamers, fan accounts that break down a play in 30 seconds and get 1 million views by sunrise. The audience doesn't need you to simply show them the game. They need you to add something. They need you to make them feel like they're seeing more than what's on the screen. That's why this was never just a guest spot. It was a statement, and statements create enemies. So before Caitlin Clark even sits down, you already have the 2 sides forming. On one side, the people who want something fresh, people who are tired of the same safe voices saying the same safe things. On the other side, the people who feel like the door is being opened for the wrong person. The people who treat basketball knowledge like it comes with a passport stamp. Like if you didn't do a specific thing in a specific league, your brain doesn't count. And you could practically see the reactions getting preloaded. Like they didn't even need to wait for a reason. They were ready to pounce the second she stumbled over a name, or paused too long, or made one awkward joke. Because once you decide someone doesn't belong, you start hunting for proof. That's why this moment had pressure stacked on pressure. Not the normal nervous on camera pressure. The pressure of knowing millions of people are watching, and a loud chunk of them are praying for you to fail. Not because they hate you personally, but because your success threatens their worldview. And Caitlin Clark knows that world exists. She's lived in it. She's watched what happens when women's basketball gets treated like a side quest instead of the main story. She's watched people talk about her like she's a product, a trend, a headline, instead of a player who can actually change how fans think about the game. She's watched the compliment that isn't a compliment. She plays like a guy. Like that's the only way to describe greatness. So when she steps into the NBA broadcast space, it's not some innocent debut. It's a collision. And the reason the competitor video went so viral is because it understood one thing. Viewers love a moment where the hierarchy gets shaken. They love the idea of the outsider, walking into a room full of legends and making everyone shift in their seat. They love when somebody unexpected becomes the smartest person in the room. But here's the twist. The internet immediately tried to turn it into a superhero movie. They wanted it to be magical. They wanted dramatic sound effects. They wanted the "he wasn't ready" moment. They wanted someone's jaw to drop on cue. They wanted it to feel like the NBA's biggest secret got pulled out of a locked drawer and held up to the camera. And when you frame it like that, you miss the real story. Because the real story isn't that Caitlin Clark needed to prove she's smart. The real story is that the basketball world has been acting like this kind of thinking is rare, when it's actually been around, just ignored or talked over. And that's why this moment hit so hard. Because it wasn't only about what she might say on TV. It was about what her presence implies. That there are different ways to understand basketball, and some of those ways have been dismissed for years because the people using them didn't look like the traditional experts. Now let's talk about NBC for a second, because the network is part of the drama too. Networks don't just put people on a desk for fun, especially not in a high-pressure environment, because they know what comes with it. The backlash, the headlines, the weird think pieces, the angry comments, the clips that get taken out of context. If you do it, you're doing it because you believe the upside is worth the noise. So why would NBC want Caitlin Clark on an NBA broadcast desk? Because she's not just a basketball player. She's a cultural event. She pulls in people who don't normally care about regular season NBA debates. She pulls in younger audiences. She pulls in casual fans who want a story. And she pulls in hardcore hoop heads who want to see if she actually understands the pro game the way they understand it. In other words, she's the rare person who creates curiosity from every direction. And curiosity is the most valuable thing in sports media right now. But that's also why it's dangerous. Because when you bring in someone like that, you're forcing the sport to look at itself. You're forcing commentators to level up or get exposed as performance artists. You're forcing viewers to ask, wait, why do we accept lazy analysis from some people, but demand perfection from others? And once people start asking those questions, they don't stop. That's why the critics were ready. You could almost hear them warming up the microphones. They weren't just skeptical. They were personally offended. And the funniest part is, they tried to disguise it as protecting the integrity of the game. Like integrity is fragile enough to be destroyed by one woman speaking about pick-and-roll coverages. No, what they were protecting was the feeling of ownership. Because for decades, NBA commentary has been an exclusive club where the biggest membership card is, "I used to play." And that's not always a bad thing. Former players can bring unbelievable insight. But the problem is, the club started confusing "I played" with "I'm automatically the best teacher." And teaching is a different skill. Some people played at the highest level and can explain the game like a scientist breaking down a pattern. Other people played at the highest level and can barely explain why a screen worked without turning it into, "he wanted it more." So when Caitlin Clark gets the mic, she's not just showing up as a guest. She's quietly challenging the idea that the old path is the only path. And the old path does not like being challenged. That's why the pressure became suffocating. Because if she does great, it forces a conversation the establishment doesn't want. A conversation like, wait, how many analysts have we been overpaying to say nothing? And if she does bad, the establishment gets to feel right. It gets to say, see? That's what happens when you let the wrong people in. So either way, they thought they'd win. Which is exactly why this moment mattered. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because while everyone was treating this like a trial, Caitlin Clark didn't walk in like someone begging to be accepted. She walked in like someone who's been underestimated her whole life and got tired of explaining herself. And when you have that kind of confidence, it changes the air in the room. Not because you're loud, because you're steady. The loudest people in sports media usually rely on volume to sound important. They talk fast, they talk big, they talk like every sentence should be a quote on a graphic. But the people who really see the game, they don't always need to yell. They can just point at something and let the truth do the work. And that's why the idea of Clark on an NBA desk scared people. Because if she's calm, direct, and sharp, it makes the rest of the desk look like they've been coasting. And now you're not comparing her to other guests. You're comparing her to the standard. That's when things get messy. So the night begins, and the tension is already built. You can imagine the producer in the back, reading the temperature of the room like it's a weather report. You can imagine the camera crew catching those little micro-moments, the quick glances, the tight smiles, the body language that says, "All right, let's see what happens." Because everybody knows what the audience is doing. They're not just watching the game. They're watching her. They're waiting for the first moment they can clip, the first awkward pause, the first misstep, the first sign that she's out of her depth. And the reason that moment is so dangerous is because viewers aren't neutral. They're emotional. They're tribal. They already picked a side before the broadcast started. Some people wanted her to dominate the desk like a genius. Some people wanted her to crash. And the broadcast became the battlefield. But the real battle wasn't about who can talk best. It was about who gets to be taken seriously. And once you understand that, you start seeing the NBA's biggest secret differently. Because the secret isn't a hidden file. It isn't a conspiracy. It isn't a secret meeting where owners admit something on record. The secret is simpler, and that's why it stings. The secret is that basketball understanding is not owned by a single league. And the second a mainstream audience starts believing that, the whole hierarchy starts shaking. And that brings us to the next part, the part where the broadcast stops being a segment and starts feeling like a moment NBC absolutely planned for, even if they couldn't control how big it would become. Because when the questions get real, when the conversation turns from hype to actual hoops, that's where you find out whether this was a stunt, or whether Caitlin Clark was about to make a lot of people regret assuming she was just there to smile for the camera. And the wild part is, the people who were most confident she'd fail were the same people who had the most to lose if she didn't. But that wasn't the whole story, because the next step wasn't about her presence anymore. It was about what happens when she actually starts breaking the game down in a way that makes the experts look uncomfortable. And here's where everything shifts. Because it's one thing to sit at a desk and nod along. It's one thing to laugh at a joke, throw in a safe comment, and survive the segment. That's what a lot of critics expected. They thought this would be a polite cameo, a marketing moment, a quick ratings boost. But when the conversation starts turning toward real basketball, defensive coverages, late-game adjustments, matchup hunting, that's when the tone changes. That's when you find out whether someone is decoration or disruption. And this is the part the internet twists into legend. Because what actually matters isn't some fantasy 12-0 run prediction or dramatic Hollywood speech. What matters is far simpler and way more threatening. It's when she speaks with certainty. See, confidence hits differently when it's quiet. When someone explains something without hedging every sentence. When they don't soften their analysis just to make the room comfortable. When they don't add a million disclaimers so nobody feels challenged. That's when you feel the shift. And here's the reality most fans don't notice. Television is rhythm. There's a cadence to how analysts talk. The veterans know it. They know when to pause. They know when to hype. They know when to toss it back to the host. But when someone breaks rhythm, not by being awkward, but by being sharper than expected, it changes the energy. Because now everyone at the desk has to react in real time. If this was just the beginning, what happens when she's fully comfortable in that role? Because the first appearance is always the most cautious. The real disruption comes when someone realizes they're not just surviving in the space. They're thriving. And once that happens, the narrative flips from "does she belong?" to "who else have we been overlooking?" And that's when the Real revolution begins. But that is where things get even more uncomfortable. Because the next layer isn't about broadcasting. It's about what the NBA culture quietly resists admitting about itself. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because once the noise fades, once the viral clips settle, once the dramatic exaggerations cool down, you're left with a quieter, sharper question. Why did this moment feel threatening in the first place? It wasn't because a WNBA player sat at an NBA desk. It was because she didn't shrink. She didn't overcompensate. She didn't treat the moment like she was grateful just to be invited. And that challenges something deeply embedded in NBA culture. The idea that proximity to the league automatically equals intellectual authority over the sport. For decades, the NBA has positioned itself as the peak of basketball evolution. The best athletes, the best minds, the best system. And to be fair, in terms of global reach and talent density, it absolutely sits at the top. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Being the most athletic league in the world doesn't automatically mean it owns the deepest strategic imagination. That's the nerve Clark's presence presses on. Because when she explains a rotation calmly and clearly, or talks about spacing like it's geometry instead of chaos, she's subtly proving something. Basketball understanding isn't confined to one ecosystem. And that's where the resistance kicks in. Not publicly, not in press releases, quietly. Because the NBA machine runs on hierarchy. Rookies defer to veterans. Analysts defer to champions. Networks defer to star power. It's layered, structured, predictable. So when someone from outside the traditional NBA pipeline speaks with confidence, and the audience responds positively, it disrupts that order. And disruption in sports culture always gets interpreted as disrespect. If she sounds certain, some hear arrogance. If she critiques a decision, some hear attack. If she speaks directly, some hear challenge. But that interpretation says more about the listener than the speaker. Because here's the truth. The modern NBA is incredibly system-driven. Spacing is optimized. Shot charts are standardized. Three-point frequency has exploded. Offenses often revolve around variations of the same core actions: high pick and roll, drive and kick, 5-out spacing. Defensively, teams switch aggressively or drop coverage depending on personnel. It's brilliant. It's efficient. It's also increasingly familiar. And when something becomes familiar, it becomes easier to map. Now imagine someone who grew up obsessively studying patterns, not just highlights, not just superstar moments, but movement tendencies, timing shifts, micro-adjustments. Imagine someone trained to see where the help defender is leaning before the ball even moves. That perspective doesn't clash with the NBA. It exposes blind spots in how we talk about it. Because most televised NBA analysis doesn't go deep into micro-patterns. It stays accessible. It stays broad. It stays personality-driven. And again, that's not wrong. But it leaves space for someone who goes sharper. And when that sharper voice comes from a place the establishment historically undervalued, it forces reflection. Now here's the part people don't like saying out loud. Women's basketball has often required a different type of strategic emphasis. Not because it's better, because it had to be. Without the same vertical explosion or sheer physical dominance, the margins get tighter. Precision matters more. Timing matters more. Off-ball movement becomes critical. Defensive communication becomes survival. That environment naturally produces players who see nuance differently. So when Clark speaks about the NBA through that lens, she's not invading sacred territory. She's adding a layer. And layers reveal depth. That's why this moment didn't just feel like crossover hype. It felt like cultural friction. Because for years, the NBA narrative machine has subtly positioned the WNBA as a parallel universe, respected but separate, admired but secondary. And when someone bridges that gap seamlessly, it messes with that mental separation. It suggests continuity. It suggests a quality of understanding. And that's more destabilizing than any hot take. Because now the audience starts connecting dots. They start wondering why certain WNBA strategic discussions never get amplified the same way. They start noticing that insight doesn't correlate perfectly with league revenue. They start asking whether we've been filtering who gets labeled genius. And when those questions start circulating, institutions feel it. Not because they're villains, because systems naturally protect their existing structure. Now let's talk about fear. Not dramatic fear. Professional fear. Coaches in the NBA operate under insane pressure. Analysts do too. One bad season, one bad narrative, one wrong call in a high-profile moment, and careers shift. Innovation is risky. Deviation is risky. Trying something new when millions are watching is risky. So the league gravitates toward proven formulas. And proven formulas become culture. Culture becomes tradition. Tradition becomes protection. So when Clark's presence suggests there might be overlooked strategic imagination out there, when it hints that the game could be seen differently, it brushes against that protective shell. Because the implication isn't the NBA is bad. The implication is the NBA could still evolve. And evolution always threatens comfort. That's why the mythologized version of the story blew up so fast. Because fans crave disruption. They crave moments where someone shakes the system and doesn't apologize for it. They love the idea of a young star walking into a room full of legends and making them reconsider something. It's cinematic. But even without the dramatic exaggerations, the underlying tension remains. Clark's presence didn't expose a scandal. It exposed insecurity. Not hers. The culture's. And here's the subtle twist. She didn't have to say anything revolutionary to do that. Just being competent, visibly competent, was enough. That's how low the bar of expectation was for some critics. They didn't expect her to command the space. They expected her to decorate it. And when someone refuses to decorate and instead contributes, authority recalibrates. Now zoom out even further. The NBA isn't just competing against itself. It's competing for cultural relevance in a world where audiences have infinite options. If the next generation values analytical clarity and authenticity over recycled commentary, the league has to adapt. If they don't platform voices that resonate with younger fans, someone else will. That's why NBC's move wasn't reckless. It was strategic. They saw where attention is going. And attention is the currency of modern sports. Caitlin Clark holds attention. Not just because she shoots deep threes. Because she represents momentum. Momentum toward integration. Momentum toward smarter discourse. Momentum toward breaking the invisible wall between leagues. And that momentum doesn't feel neutral. It feels like change. And change always makes someone uncomfortable. Now here's the most interesting part of all. Clark doesn't even have to actively challenge the NBA for this shift to continue. All she has to do is keep showing up. Keep being sharp. Keep being steady. Keep refusing to shrink. Because every appearance chips away at the old narrative. Every clear breakdown chips away at the assumption that only one pipeline produces elite basketball thinkers. And slowly, without fireworks, the audience recalibrates its expectations. The conversation shifts from "why is she here?" to "why weren't more voices like this here sooner?" And once that question becomes normal, the hierarchy quietly transforms. That's why this isn't about one broadcast. It's about trajectory. If she leans into this lane long-term, balancing playing career with analytical presence, she becomes something rare. A bridge. A bridge between leagues. Between generations. Between athletic dominance and intellectual articulation. And bridges change landscapes. Because once people cross them, they don't want to go back. Now think about the ripple effect. Young girls watching see someone who can dominate on the court and command a broadcast desk. Young boys watching see a woman explain NBA strategy clearly and confidently. Future analysts see a blueprint that doesn't require yelling to be powerful. That's cultural shift. And cultural shifts don't announce themselves loudly. They settle in quietly until one day the old way feels outdated. That's the real secret. Not a hidden file. Not a conspiracy. Just this. Basketball intelligence was never owned by a single league. And the moment mainstream audiences fully internalize that, the entire ecosystem has to expand. And when ecosystems expand, they don't ask permission from the old guard. They grow around them. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the next phase isn't about proving she belongs on a desk. It's about what happens if the league itself starts embracing that expansion instead of resisting it. And that's where alliances, power plays, and long-term strategy come into the picture. Now we step into the part nobody likes to talk about publicly: power. Because once a moment like that happens, once the audience responds, once the clips circulate, once the tension is obvious, the conversation shifts from "can she do this?" to something way more strategic. What do we do with this? That's when it stops being about a segment. It becomes about positioning. See, leagues don't just think in terms of games. They think in terms of control. Narrative control. Cultural control. Brand control. The NBA has spent decades crafting an image: progressive, global, stylish, modern. It sells not just basketball, but identity. So when a new voice enters that ecosystem and gains traction instantly, it creates a fork in the road. Option 1, absorb it. Option 2, minimize it. Historically, powerful institutions choose absorption when something has momentum. They don't fight it. They incorporate it. They position it as part of the plan all along. And that's where things get fascinating. Because Caitlin Clark isn't just an analyst cameo. She's a bridge asset. She connects audiences that traditionally exist in parallel lanes. NBA fans who don't usually watch WNBA. WNBA fans who don't usually watch studio breakdowns. Younger fans who don't trust traditional media. Casual viewers who follow personalities more than teams. She sits at the intersection of all those circles. And intersections are powerful. Now imagine you're in a boardroom. You see ratings spike. You see engagement spike. You see cross-platform traction spike. That's not noise. That's leverage. And leverage changes negotiations. It changes how often someone is invited back. It changes how prominently they're featured. It changes how much freedom they're given to speak. Because here's the subtle truth about live television. Not everyone gets the same leash. Some analysts are tightly scripted. Some are carefully steered. Others are allowed to roam. If Clark continues to demonstrate clarity and composure, that leash extends. An extended leash equals influence. Now think about what that influence could mean long-term. If she becomes a regular presence in NBA media spaces while still actively playing at an elite level, she becomes something the sport hasn't fully seen before, a dual force. A current player shaping the conversation in real time, not years after retirement. That's rare. Usually, commentary authority comes after playing authority fades. But if those timelines overlap, the hierarchy scrambles. Because now you have someone influencing perception while still influencing outcomes on the court. That's a different kind of power. And power makes people cautious. Not necessarily hostile. Cautious. Because the moment someone can shape both the narrative and the play, they become bigger than a single role. Now let's address the elephant in the room. There's a gender dynamic here, whether people want to admit it or not. Basketball culture, especially at the professional level, has long been male-dominated in both playing and analysis spaces. That's just fact. So when a woman steps into that traditionally male analysis lane and does it seamlessly, it doesn't just shift basketball dialogue. It shifts cultural optics. And optics matter. Because representation at the highest level sends signals about who is allowed to speak with authority. For decades, women in basketball media were often placed in sideline roles, hosting roles, or narrative storytelling roles, valuable, important roles, but not always positioned as tactical authorities at the same frequency as former male players. Clark disrupts that pattern, not by demanding it loudly, by embodying it. And embodiment is harder to dismiss. You can argue against a concept. It's harder to argue against visible competence. Now imagine young players watching this unfold. They don't see boundaries the same way older generations did. They see fluidity. They see someone cross leagues intellectually without friction. That normalizes crossover authority. And normalization is how culture changes. The first time something happens, it feels controversial. The 10th time, it feels expected. The 100th time, it feels obvious. Clark's presence could accelerate that timeline. And here's the twist that makes this even more strategic. The NBA benefits from that normalization. It wants to appear inclusive. It wants to appear progressive. It wants to align with the next generation's values. So instead of resisting someone like Clark, the smarter move is partnership. And partnerships reshape ecosystems. Now imagine a future where collaboration between NBA and WNBA analysis becomes routine. Where insights flow both directions. Where strategic innovation isn't siloed by league branding. That doesn't weaken the NBA. It strengthens the overall basketball ecosystem. But here's the catch. To embrace that future, the league has to let go of a subtle superiority complex. It has to acknowledge that elite thinking doesn't only emerge from its own pipeline, and institutions rarely surrender superiority easily. That's why this moment matters so much. It's not explosive. It's evolutionary. And evolution is harder to stop than revolution, because it doesn't look like an attack. It looks like progress. Now let's take this even further. If Clark continues to sharpen her media presence, she doesn't just become a bridge between leagues. She becomes a bridge between eras. Older fans respect skill and preparation. Younger fans respect authenticity and intelligence. If she balances both, she occupies a rare space. And rare spaces command attention. That's when endorsement deals evolve. That's when media roles expand. That's when influence multiplies beyond the hardwood. And once influence multiplies, so does voice. A powerful voice inside the sport can advocate for structural change in subtle ways. Equal resources, equal amplification, equal analytical respect. And if that advocacy feels organic rather than confrontational, it becomes hard to oppose. Because opposing it starts looking regressive. And no modern league wants to look regressive. Now zoom back to the emotional core of this entire story. Why did fans react so strongly? Because people love watching ceilings shatter quietly. Not with anger. With competence. It's satisfying. It's validating. It feels like justice. And when something feels like justice, it builds loyalty. Clark's biggest asset in all of this isn't hype. It's credibility. If she keeps stacking credible moments, on the court and off, she becomes untouchable in conversation. And untouchable voices don't ask for space. They create it. That's when the power dynamic flips. Instead of asking, will the NBA allow this? The question becomes, can the NBA afford not to? Because audiences decide faster than boardrooms. If fans embrace crossover intelligence, the league adapts. It always has. Hand-checking disappeared when the game evolved. Post-centric offenses faded when spacing took over. Mid-range dominance gave way to three-point volume. Culture adapts to efficiency. And right now, analytical clarity is efficient. It travels well. It clips well. It teaches well. And teaching builds deeper fandom than yelling ever could. Now imagine this trajectory 5 years from now. Clark is still playing at a high level. She's a regular analytical presence. Younger analysts follow her blueprint. The audience expects smarter breakdowns. WNBA strategy is discussed on NBA panels without novelty framing. That world doesn't feel radical. It feels natural. But it starts with moments like this. Moments where someone steps into a space, performs steadily, and forces everyone to recalibrate expectations. That's the quiet revolution. Not fireworks. Recalibration. And once recalibration happens, it's permanent. The biggest secret wasn't some hidden formula. It was this. The boundaries between leagues were always more cultural than intellectual. And the second someone crosses them smoothly, the illusion dissolves. And when illusions dissolve, ecosystems expand. The only question left is how far that expansion goes. Because the next phase isn't just about Clark proving herself again. It's about whether the basketball world leans into that expansion or tries to slow it down. And if history tells us anything about momentum, slowing it down rarely works. And this is where the story stops being about one person and starts being about the future of the entire ecosystem. Because momentum doesn't ask permission. Once an audience tastes something different, something sharper, something more precise, something that makes them feel like they're seeing the game in higher resolution, they don't easily go back to low resolution. That's the quiet shift happening underneath all the noise. For years, sports broadcasting has leaned heavily on personality. Big reactions, big arguments, big statements. It works. It drives engagement. It fuels debate clips and social media battles. But there's a ceiling to that formula. At some point, viewers crave substance. Not lectures. Not complexity for the sake of complexity. Clarity. And clarity is disruptive in an environment built on spectacle. That's why this moment with Caitlin Clark felt bigger than it technically was. It hinted at a pivot point, a possible evolution. Because if networks realize that audiences respond strongly to precise, confident breakdowns, especially from unexpected voices, they're going to chase that formula. And once multiple networks chase it, it stops being an experiment. It becomes the new normal. Now think about the ripple effect inside locker rooms. Players watch broadcasts too. They hear what analysts say. They know who actually understands the game and who's just filling airtime. If players begin respecting crossover analysts who genuinely break down actions with depth, that respect travels. It changes who gets invited to training camps as consultants. It changes who gets asked to speak at clinics. It changes whose voice carries weight behind closed doors. And that's where real power lives, not in viral clips, but in quiet influence. Because the NBA has always been a copycat league strategically. When one team finds an edge, others replicate it. When one concept works, it spreads. The same applies to media influence. If one crossover analyst becomes widely respected, others will follow. Doors open a little wider. And that's when the hierarchy doesn't explode. It stretches. Stretching is how systems survive disruption. But stretching also permanently alters shape. Now here's something even more interesting. Caitlin Clark isn't entering this conversation from a neutral position. She's entering it as someone who already commands massive attention as a player. That means she doesn't need validation from analysts to sustain her relevance. She generates her own gravity. And gravity attracts opportunity. The NBA understands star gravity better than anyone. It built its global dominance on it. Magic and Bird, Jordan, Kobe, LeBron, Steph, each era anchored by personalities who shaped culture beyond the court. Clark has that type of cultural gravity in women's basketball. If she leverages that gravity across leagues, she becomes a unifying figure in a way the sport hasn't fully seen before. And unity, across gender lines, across audience segments, is commercially powerful. Now ask yourself, what does that mean long-term? It means the league can't afford to treat moments like this as novelty. Because novelty fades. Integration endures. If they integrate voices like Clark's consistently, they future-proof themselves. They align with evolving audience expectations. If they resist integration, they risk looking stuck. And stuck is dangerous in a digital era where fans can build alternative ecosystems overnight. YouTube analysts, independent podcasters, film breakdown creators. They already exist. They already command millions of views. The monopoly on basketball explanation is gone forever. So the NBA has two choices. Elevate diverse, credible voices within its ecosystem. Or watch those voices thrive independently and siphon attention away. That's the strategic crossroads hiding beneath this entire story. Now let's talk about ego. Because ego is the silent player in every professional arena. Coaches have ego. Players have ego. Analysts have ego. Executives have ego. Ego protects territory. And when someone new steps into territory traditionally guarded by veterans, ego reacts. Not always publicly, but internally. It asks questions like, why her? Why now? What makes her different? And the honest answer to that last question is the most uncomfortable one. She represents evolution without waiting her turn. That's the part that unsettles traditional structures. Because sports culture has long valued seniority. You earn your stripes. You climb the ladder. You retire, then analyze. But modern culture doesn't operate strictly on ladders anymore. It operates on impact. If you can provide value immediately, audiences don't care how long you've waited. That shift from seniority-based authority to impact-based authority is massive. And Caitlin Clark walking into an NBA desk and speaking confidently is a symbol of that shift. It's not about disrespecting veterans. It's about redefining what qualifies as authority. And redefining authority reshapes industries. Now imagine 10 years from now. A young analyst emerges. Maybe someone who played overseas. Maybe someone who never played professionally but studied obsessively. And they command attention because they communicate brilliantly. The audience won't automatically dismiss them. Because the precedent will have been set. That's the power of visible crossover success. It lowers resistance for the next person. And the next. And the next. That's how culture shifts permanently. Not with a single explosion. With repeated normalization. Now let's return to the emotional core again. Why did so many fans frame this moment as exposing a secret? Because it feels good to believe something hidden has been revealed. It feels cinematic. It feels dramatic. But the real exposure wasn't about secret data or hidden conspiracies. It was about assumptions. The assumption that elite basketball thinking must come from a narrow pipeline. The assumption that authority must look a certain way. The assumption that crossover voices are novelty, not substance. When those assumptions crack, people experience it as revelation. And revelation spreads fast online. But the long-term effect is quieter. It's expectation. Once viewers see someone cross leagues intellectually and perform with confidence, they start expecting that level of clarity everywhere. And expectation drives evolution faster than controversy ever could. Now here's the part that truly matters. Caitlin Clark doesn't have to chase controversy to maintain relevance. She doesn't have to expose anything dramatically. All she has to do is remain consistent. Consistency compounds credibility. Credibility compounds influence. Influence compounds power. And power, when used strategically, reshapes landscapes. If she chooses to continue building in both lanes, playing and analyzing, she becomes something incredibly rare. A living bridge between competition and commentary. Between performance and perspective. Between the present and the future. And bridges don't just connect. They redefine distance. What once felt far apart suddenly feels adjacent. NBA and WNBA discussions blend more naturally. Strategic conversations become less siloed. Audience segments overlap more comfortably. That's the subtle revolution unfolding. And revolutions built on competence are the hardest to stop. Because there's nothing to attack. No scandal. No controversy. Just visible capability. And visible capability forces adaptation. So the biggest secret wasn't some hidden truth about the NBA. It was this. The sport is evolving beyond old boundaries, and the only thing that ever held those boundaries in place was habit. Habit can feel like tradition. Tradition can feel like law. But once habit breaks, tradition adjusts, and law becomes suggestion. The moment Caitlin Clark stepped confidently into that NBA broadcast space, one habit cracked. The idea that analytical authority must come from one lane. And once a crack forms, light gets in. The only question now isn't whether she belongs. That question already feels outdated. The real question is how far this expansion goes. Because if this was just the beginning, then the next phase won't just be about one desk appearance. It'll be about redefining who gets to shape the future of basketball conversation entirely. And that future? It's already closer than most people realize.